In this season of stewardship, we need to think about what we will pledge as our annual gift to the church on Stewardship Sunday, which is November 22nd, 2015. Toward that end, I'm here today to talk about what stewardship really means, what it means to our relationship with God, to the life of this church, and to our world around us. We must ask ourselves, just what does stewardship mean? Many people in our community were intrigued by the recent visit to Philadelphia of Pope Francis I. Pope Francis brought with him a universal message of hope centering around a few key themes: the need for us to take better care of the poor, the need for us to practice economic justice in both the distribution of wealth and the distribution of scarce resources, and the need for us to curtail uncontrolled development. Pope Francis's message is really about stewardship. Stewardship of our world, stewardship of our relationships in our communities, and ultimately stewardship of the gifts that we leave for future generations. So how does the Pope's message apply to our stewardship campaign here at Paoli United Methodist Church? In our first scripture, from the first book of Genesis, God granted humankind dominion over every living thing on earth. John Wesley, in his explanatory notes on the Old Testament, wrote that by granting dominion over the animals and plants of the world, God made man and woman his representatives on earth. Wesley wrote that God gave his representatives a large inheritance. We are given the earth to multiply its gifts and to replenish these gifts for future generations. So to Wesley, dominion means growth and replenishment. It means that we have a God-given obligation to live in harmony with the earth and to improve it for future generations. By doing so, we bring honor and praise to God. In the Pope's papal encyclical, Laudato Si, which was published by the Vatican earlier this year, Pope Francis sets out his new Gospel of Creation, which critiques the current state of man's domination rather than dominion over the earth. Laudato Si argues that today, mankind is out of balance with creation in such areas as pollution, climate change, the lack of good water resources, the loss of biodiversity, and global inequality. Pope Francis wrote, and I quote, "A spirituality which forgets God as all-powerful and as creator is not acceptable. The best way to restore men and women to their rightful place is to speak once more about the figure of a father who creates and who alone owns the world. Otherwise, human beings will always try to impose their own laws and their own interests on reality." Pope Francis concludes that mankind's dominion over the world means responsible stewardship. This radical view of dominion as stewardship has its counterpart in our relationship here to this church and our Christian obligation for all of us to sustain and to grow our present missions for future generations. Our stewardship video today will talk about mission, to focus on the missions of this church, what these missions mean to this church, and how we can grow the missions of this church. At Paoli United Methodist, we have a credo: love God, follow Christ, and serve others. When we fulfill this credo, we make a commitment to faithful stewardship of our spiritual home. In our second scripture reading, St. Paul writes to the Corinthians that those of us who sow sparingly will reap sparingly. Those of us who sow generously will reap generously. Now, Paul is not only speaking about financial gifts or tithes here. He's talking about the ministries through which we serve our neighbors. By ministering to others, we glorify God. And ministry grows only through our generosity. Today's scripture from Paul is clear. Our ministry to God and to our community proves our love of God and our community. Where we are generous in ministry, God will generously bestow his love to us. Here at Paoli, our ministries are abundant. We have the youth program, the SAW mission trips, Good Works Day, men's and women's ministries. We have community outreach, the rummage sale, car show, visitation to the sick and to the homebound. And every Sunday, we have such great music ministries, the praise team, the praise band, contemporary music, traditional music. For much of this, we thank Mike Jackson, our music minister. God has given us this fantastic community of faith, Paoli United Methodist Church. As members of this church, we have God-given obligation to not only maintain what we have. As stewards, we are required to oversee and grow the ministries of this church for the next generation of faithful Christians. In the words of Paul, what an indescribable gift we have in Paoli United Methodist Church. Our ministries are the lifeblood of this church. So, our 2015 stewardship campaign will focus on our ministries. By ministry, I mean all the great things that we do for and through Paoli United Methodist Church, and the great things that this church does for all of us. But as with everything good and worthwhile, we face challenges. We need to look deep into our hearts and find ways to grow this church so that we can continue to make disciples of Christ for the transformation of the world. In this stewardship season, we need to show God that we believe in Paoli United Methodist Church. We need to stay involved in the life of this church. We need to lead and not to follow. We need to cherish the missions of this church so that we can magnify this indescribable gift that God gives to us each and every Sunday. Recently, our youth introduced a new ministry where they did many great works in the community by helping people with housework, garden chores, and other tasks. Instead of seeking payment in return, our youth gave out golden tickets that said, "Pay it forward." By paying it forward, our youth are asking the recipients of the good works to do good works for others in return. In short, our youth are expanding our church's ministries into our community and spreading God's grace to others. The effect of their good works is thereby magnified. What an inspiring way to spread God's grace. So I ask you, as stewards of our church's ministries, will we sow sparingly or will we sow generously? Are we prepared to share and grow this indescribable gift that we have here at Paoli United Methodist Church? Can we build upon the good foundations that we have for future generations? In this season of stewardship, we must carefully guide our church to a position of strength by growing our good works for the next generation, both financially and in mission. We must remember the words of Pope Francis, and I quote, "Intergenerational solidarity is not optional, since the world we receive also belongs to those who will follow after us." God has entrusted us as stewards of Paoli United Methodist Church, and just as we are called upon to multiply our missions, so are we called upon to multiply our gifts and our profound faith in the life of this church. My friends, let us care for God's creation and for this church. Let us follow the example of Pope Francis and John Wesley, and let's follow the example of our own youth. May it be so. Amen.